Well, in the midst of escalating worldwide war and rumors of war, there is an horrendous pain and suffering being inflicted upon millions of people around the world, 24 hours a day, and literally nothing is being reported. Around the world, governmental leaders at all levels join in cynical silence with religious leaders to suppress the screams and the tormented, and literally, by their silence and sinister policies, enable the rape and the torture and the death of countless millions. Now, who are those who are suffering and dying with literally no civil and few religious authorities coming to their aid? Well, they're primarily Christians in countries who shamelessly kill and torture those who don't bow to their atheistic, Islamic, Hindu, or other religious ideologies. Today on Stand in the Gap, Pastor Isaac Crocket and I will begin a two-part program entitled Wake Up America, Worldwide Persecution and Death, Increasing and Advancing. Our guest will be Dede Laugeson, Executive Director of Save the Persecuted Christians. Now, overshadowed by other headline news, the persecution of primarily Christians around the world is setting historically bad records. And the world sits idly by like the churches did in Germany when the trains rolled down the tracks to Auschwitz. And to cover the noise, they just sang louder and ignored the screams. Well, today on Stand in the Gap, we thought it was time to update our Stand in the Gap viewers about a reality of life, though ignored officially, is one that we cannot ignore. Today, we'll discuss persecution past and present, and identify the worst perpetrators of persecution. Next week, in Part 2, we'll discuss persecution and its political enablers, and we'll provide a fascinating update on the role of our past and present U.S. presidents and U.S. administrations and their relationship to persecution policies. And we'll conclude by providing a look ahead at persecution and its prognosis. How fast is it growing? And should we consider the potential for persecution here in America? Now, throughout Scripture, the incidence of persecution, often harsh and cruel, is not only recorded but prophesied. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he said in Matthew 5, verses 10 to 12, he said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And then Jesus reminded his disciples in Matthew 24 and elsewhere that accompanying the end of times, the signs of deception and wars and threats of wars, plagues and famines, there would also be an increase of truth usurpers, false prophets, and with that would arise persecution led by civil authorities. In Matthew 10, in verses 16 through 19, Jesus says in part, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So beware of men, for they will deliver you over to the courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake." And with that, let me welcome into the program right now on this most important topic, Dede Laugeson. Dede, thanks for being back with Isaac and I again here on Stand in the Gap.
Hi, Pastor. It's so good to be back with you. Thank you for being here.
Well, Dede, thank you for the work that you're doing in helping to bring this important information forward. Just to get us going on this program today, give us a look back, if you don't mind. What kind of changes are we seeing on the frequency and the intensity of the persecution of Christians? Go back a little bit and then bring it up to where we are. Status? Is it static? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Give us an overview, if you can, just to start this program, could you?
When we started our work as a coalition of civil society members and faith leaders and political leaders, all concerned about the rising numbers of Christian persecution globally, that was in 2018. And Open Doors USA, which has its preeminent list of the 50 most dangerous countries for Christians, that puts out the World Watch list every year. At that time, it was 215 million Christians globally heavily persecuted. Pastor, I'm sorry to say that in 4 years' time, that number has increased by 67%, now to 360 million Christians. We're at over one Christian per every man, woman, and child in the United States, and nobody is talking about this.
And Dede, those numbers are staggering. 67% increase. Ladies and gentlemen, catch what Dede just said. 215 million was the number estimated in 2018, just 4 years later. That number has now grown 67%, 360 million Christians around the world actively suffering persecution for their faith. That's just about equal to every person living in our United States. Grasp that. That'll set up our program as we now break away. We'll come back and talk to Dede, and we'll get into greater detail as we identify those nations and those places where persecution is seeing some of these most remarkable increases.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. And as we talk about this issue of persecution, we go to our friend and a guest we've had on our radio program a number of times and on this television program a few years ago, but Dede Laugeson from Save the Persecuted Christians, and your website is savethepersecutedchristians.org. You were just giving us these numbers they're really hard to comprehend, to think that from 2018 to today, we've seen a 67% increase in Christian persecution from over 2 million to now over 360 million cases. And again, we don't know for sure if those numbers are super accurate. There could be significantly more numbers that aren't being reported. As we talk about persecution, when we talk about in the broadest sense, it doesn't seem like until this recent war with Russia in Ukraine, there was a lot of talk about persecution. Now you hear, the Russian persecution in some ways of Ukraine. We heard during the Olympics, right before the invasion, we heard about the Uyghur population in China. But in general, you don't hear a lot about persecution. But when we talk about persecution, it does seem like it generally falls along religious lines. And for what we're looking at here, it seems I want to talk to you about where it's most frequent, where we most frequently see persecution or religious persecution, but also if you could maybe quantify, not exactly, but approximately how much of the religious persecutions taking place is geared at Christians as opposed to other religions.
So persecution is violence experienced against a person or community because of their religious beliefs. And all religious groups in the world are persecuted to some degree. But by far and away, the most persecuted are Christians in a historic 140 or more countries around the world. Christians face genocidal murder, mass rape, detention, disappearance. Their communities are uprooted and their properties are lost. We also hear about Uyghur Muslims, Rohingya Muslims in Burma, Uyghurs in China. They are definitely facing genocide. But for Christians, by far and away, this is the largest group persecuted in the world.
Okay, Dede, following up on that, so again, we're painting the bigger picture, and we're going to end up moving to the United States later in the next part two. But okay, primarily Christians, there is persecution of other religious groups going on. You mentioned that, but primarily Christians. All right, now let's go to here. According to your research and what we know, what countries are the locations for the worst of the persecution? Both either could be frequency or quantity. And in this category, none of them are good. They're all worst countries, but maybe start at the worst of the worst and then go down from there, and just to give us the top 5 or 6 or 10 or whatever you think we should know here and our viewers should know.
Well, I'll tell you about the top 10 in Open Doors list, and then a couple of others that Americans really should be aware of and following. Of course, we have Afghanistan. It is now at the top of the list. It goes back and forth with North Korea, which is number 2 on the list. Some of the standards: Somalia, Libya, Yemen, Eritrea. Also following very closely what's happening in Nigeria, as the whole world should be. Pakistan is horrendous. Iran, and also India. Saudi Arabia comes in at number 11, and China at 17. I would say that China is definitely one of the worst human rights abusers in the world, and for religious adherents, life there is very difficult. In the Western Hemisphere, we have Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico as well.
So, Dede, this is interesting. I mean, obviously, all of these groups that are, letting this happen or actually partaking in it, from the government, they don't care for human life. They don't care for the sanctity of, that human beings are made in the image of God. But are there specific ideologies, religions, or beliefs that when we see those creeping up, as that increases in a nation, we expect to see an increase in persecution? And if so, could you maybe share some of that with us?
So the main drivers for religious persecution in the world, and especially against Christians, are the atheistic totalitarian regimes of China, North Korea. We also have religious nationalism that you see in India with the Hindutva, very violent extremist groups. And you have the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is the head of the RSS there in India. So it is promoted from state down to the population. You also have secular states in the Western Hemisphere, and there's a lot of lawlessness, and so religious leaders are persecuted in horrendous ways. But for the vast majority of Christians, the most dangerous place for them to be is in Islamic republics or Sharia adherent countries. And in the top 10 list, 8 of those countries are Islamic republics, and that is truly the most dangerous driver against Christians in the world today.
And that it's just so frightening to hear these numbers, to hear these statistics, but to realize that we can understand that as this increases, so will the persecution. Now, these nations that are allowing this to happen, you've named nations, you've named ideologies that are, happening in those nations. What should be done to stop it? I mean, it seems like we have a lot of different organizations throughout the world that are supposed to be helping be on the watch for this. And I think, of course, of the United Nations, that's one of the goals of the United Nations, is to watch out for things like this. And they have committees and councils to weed out, for example, persecution. What is being done or what is not being done that seems to be allowing for this persecution to be increasing so drastically as it has in the last 4 years?
So you would think that the United Nations would come in along with a number of the strong Western countries like the United States and the UK and other European nations to stand strong for persecuted Christians. But what we've seen is the rise of multiculturalism, the allegations of Islamophobia. And at the UN, what you have are sheep and goat nations. The goat nations, which by far and away have the greatest influence at the UN, are those who stand opposed to Israel. And so you have a rejection of Judeo-Christian values. You have a rejection of Western values. And all of this is filtering through to the conversation, to speak about the facts of Christian persecution, that the vast majority are persecuted because of Islamic fundamentalism. That is a no-no in today's society and will get you labeled as an Islamophobe when it's the truth. This is what's happening, and you do not have nations that are willing to stand strong on their Judeo-Christian principles and defend believers of Jesus throughout the world. So they lose out.
You know, Dede, what you're saying is just, it's just almost hard for me to filter all of this, and growing up in a generation that in the millennial generation, we've had access to the internet, and I think we've just been flooded with too much information. I remember back in the 1990s, in the early days of the internet, hearing about religious persecution and the music groups and books that were written, Jesus Freaks and the devotionals and things that came out with the stories of people who were persecuted even unto death for their beliefs historically. And so as that has progressed, it feels like, or to me, I guess in my generation, we thought we would see this weeded out. And groups like you're talking about, the United Nations, we put faith in and we put our money, our taxpayers' dollars, go to those to say, okay, make sure things go smoothly. And Sam, I just want to maybe ask you, because for me, I guess, again, just seeing, maybe this is a generational thing, but my thought was, well, if I knew about this, several decades ago, and it feels like more is happening. Dede's group, Save the Persecuted Christians.org, they've done a great job of finding the information and putting it together. It seems like we should see less persecution happening. Instead, we're seeing more, and we're finding out that at the highest levels, even of the United Nations, it's not just a failure, it's not just ignorance, but it appears to be deliberate, that we're allowing, as she said, the goat nations to take control. And as you said on the radio, it's like we've put the fox in the hen house. Are you surprised by this? And what has been your view, or what do you see when you look at the lack of help and the lack of concern, that spotlighting of this major problem?
Well, Isaac, one of the things that we've talked about a lot, Dr. George Barna. You've been with him. He's on our program a lot. One of the things that I know we've noted, that even in the United States, and we're going to talk with Dede in part 2 in more specifics, but the role of the United States. Mm-hmm. The Western world has historically been the protector of the persecuted Christian and of persecuted people generally. But as we've gone quiet, it's tended to track, I think what Dede was talking about, is that as the Judeo-Christian worldview, the goat nations, Dede, that you just mentioned, as those goat nations, those that do not regard Israel, do not regard Christianity, the Bible, as we have it, and out of that then comes the concept of the sacredness of life and made in the image of God. When that worldview gets thrown out, what is it replaced with? Well, it's replaced with these other ideologies that Dede, you were talking about. And these ideologies, the Islamic, the atheist, communist, we'll talk about even the globalist mentality, that all of them tend to say man is God, government is God, and we're going to do our thing. As Judeo-Christian has tended to wane, the replacement has been this other totalitarian mentality, and one thing that they all have in common is they love to persecute people who don't agree with them. And I think it's what it comes down to. I think it's what we're witnessing, but I also think it comes off the pages of Scripture as indicative of where we are in the days in which we live, as I think we soon anticipate the Lord's return. It seems to be a lot of these things are coming together. I can't describe it just one reason. I think it's a culmination of a couple of things.
Well, Sam and Dede, what you're saying, it goes back to this fact that the heart of the problems we have is our hearts, the sin problem in our hearts, the heart of man. And Dede is, I don't know, we're coming up to a break here, but are there things that you're seeing, just options here that have maybe surprised you in the last 4 years, or kind of reasons why you've seen this increase with worldwide things that are going on?
Well, when we came together with all of these other groups who provide general assistance to persecuted Christians, and we were looking to elevate the stories and the facts about Christian persecution, we thought we would have lots of Christian churches and pastors and Christians themselves come in and support us and be behind us, and we'd create that movement to defend Christians. But what we found is that there is a softening both in the expression of our faith across America and a willingness to stand boldly and speak out against what is happening to Christians around the world. The tithe was originally instituted in the church to provide for persecuted Christians. But what we find now is that those tithes are being directed to administrative costs and to music and other things, and the persecuted Christians around the world are left forgotten, completely forgotten. And American churches, if we do not be that church of witness to stand for the martyred church, we are the ones who will suffer. It is those Christians hanging on the cross with Jesus who are calling out to us to reclaim our bold faith and to stand for persecuted Christians in the world today.
Well said, well said. Well, the title of our program, or the name of our program, is Stand in the Gap, and today looking at helping save the persecuted Christians. So we're going to be right back with more on this program.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Dede, as we wrap up this program, we've talked about a lot of things. People watching this program probably have heard things they have never heard before. And that last challenge that you gave about the silence of the American church should shock us to the core. I just about began to cry when you said it, saying just really an amazing thing. But here in the last couple of minutes, summarize again briefly the trend that we are seeing around the world relative to the persecution of Christians, and then answer this question for me. Why is it so important? Why is it so important that Americans and American Christians know and do something about this escalating persecution of Christians?
Sam, 360 million Christians around the world are heavily persecuted today. They wake up every day not knowing if they will survive till sunset. And we American Christians should be very concerned about what is happening out there, because if we are not, it is going to be here, and we are seeing all the signs of it coming to America today. We must be watching what's happening in China, where Cardinal Zen was just arrested in Hong Kong. And we must be watching what's happening in Nigeria, where a college student named Deborah was just mobbed to death for charges of blasphemy, for telling her Muslim peers to stop posting in a school chat about their Muslim views when it was supposed to be about school. She was stoned to death and burned. And we also are watching in Pakistan, where thousands of girls are stolen every year and the government does nothing. They are converted to Islam, and their perpetrators, their kidnappers, are held, are allowed to go free. So we have to watch also what's happening in India. India is a massive country, and nobody is holding them to account. And that's what Save the Persecuted Christians tries to do, is to hold these persecutors accountable for their crimes against humanity.
Dede, thank you so much. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is only part one. Next week, I want you to be back with us. Mark your calendars to be back with us. We'll engage with Dede Laugeson again. We're going to track the history of American presidents and our administrations and what has happened in the past and what is happening now in regard to persecution of Christians, either for or against. You'll be shocked. And then we're going to conclude with then what we can do. And what should we expect in America? Dede's already indicated that. We do nothing, it'll be here on our shores. Actually, the indications are already indicating that it is upon us even now. Well, thank you for being with us today. Again, thank you for praying for us on this program. I'm glad to hear from some of you all over the country. Continue to pray for us. Partner with us financially if God is blessing you through this program. And tell a friend how they can find truth and truthful information about the events of the day of greatest importance here on Stand in the Gap.